I'm Christopher Lydon, and this is Open Source, stress testing the rule of law in the age of Trump. What is breaking down, or what's broken, when the governor of Illinois says he's being invaded by the National Guard of Texas under President Trump's orders? Or when the president is dueling with Oregon and California over policing a public safety crisis that mostly disappeared 5 years ago in Portland, Oregon. What does it tell us that a senior federal judge in Boston declared in a formal opinion last week that the Trump team is bent on crushing free speech by wayward prosecutions, if only for their power to chill and intimidate? Questions keep coming. Nancy Gertner is our guest to consider them. You're overqualified, Nancy, by a celebrated career as a trial lawyer, then as a federal judge yourself, and now retired from the court as a private practitioner again, independent and outspoken about a world that you know intimately. For starters, what is your core test out there today of the risks to the rule of law?
I don't know where to begin, which is itself an indication of the problem. It is a multi-front problem with the Trump administration. It has to do with both what the Trump administration has done, starting with the least powerful among us, which is what they've done to people who they believe to be deportable. They started off in the classic poem from Germany, if you recall, which it says first they started with the gypsies, and I wasn't a gypsy, and so therefore I didn't pay attention. Well, first they started with the border, and everyone was in concert with respect to the border and people crossing into the border who were essentially unauthorized. Then they moved to people who had pending orders of deportation. Well, okay, they should have left before. Then they moved to people who are on the street who may be in category 1 or 2, who may be deportable. And then they've moved to people who were in court, who were trying to solidify their status legitimately in the United States. And then they moved, as in California, to people who were speaking Spanish in the Home Depot lot. Just this morning when I went to get coffee, I passed some people who were roofers who were speaking Spanish. And I thought I would stand there to see if ICE would come.
Wow.
So that's starting with the least powerful among us and now going way beyond anyone's concerns about people illegally in this country. Then there is the attack on the media, which was grotesque, the Jimmy Kimmel incident. Then there was the attack on the law firms. So you're talking about a president who seems hell-bent on fracturing civil society and flexing his muscles in a way that no president ever has or indeed should. So I don't know where to begin when you talk about the stress test. It is a multi-front problem.
Nancy Gertner, I'd like to hear you read from this opinion from the federal court in Boston, Judge William Young, which hooked my interest. The question in the case at hand was whether the First Amendment's protection of free speech covers green card and other immigrants as securely as it protects full citizens. Judge Young ruled emphatically, yes, it does. But more striking to me was his 161-page opinion on justice in the Trump era. And furthermore, on the nature of our president himself. A man, says Judge Young, who ignores everything and keeps bullying on. To my eye, the opinion reads more like a literary than a legal document, something that ought to be read aloud, somewhere between a bedtime story and a Patrick Henry or Thomas Paine broadside about rights and liberties from the 18th century. I want to hear the highlights of that opinion in your voice and your comment as you go.
I'm not sure that it is bedtime reading, because I think that if anyone reads it at bedtime, they will not sleep. So I'm not sure that that's the right way to go. But let me just start off by framing the decision. Judge Young said categorically that non-citizens in the United States have First Amendment rights to speak.
Comes with the territory, not...
Comes with the territory. You're on our soil, you have those rights. Now, to be sure, the plaintiffs, the people who were suing in this case, were green card holders and people with lawful visas. So one person was the Tufts University student Ozturk, and the second was a student from Columbia.
Yep.
He has a green card, and he was picked up when he was applying for citizenship, the citizenship interview. So he said as to that category of people, they clearly have First Amendment rights, and the First Amendment rights, the equivalent of American citizens, which was an extraordinary and important thing to say. Then he said that this administration has violated those rights. Then he went on about what the remedy should be. What should I do about this? And in that, he concluded the following. For all these reasons, this court finds as fact and concludes as a matter of law that Secretaries Noem and Rubio and their agents and subordinates acted in concert to misuse the sweeping powers of their respective offices to target non-citizen pro-Palestinian for deportation, primarily on account of their First Amendment protected political speech. They did so in order to strike fear into similarly situated non-citizen pro-Palestinian individuals, proactively and effectively curbing lawful pro-Palestinian speech and intentionally denying such individuals, including the plaintiffs here, the freedom of speech that is their right. Moreover, the effect of these targeted deportation proceedings continues unconstitutionally to chill freedom of speech to this day. Those were his conclusions, and they were terribly important to say. The Trump administration has done everything it can to suggest that the people it is targeting are not human, are not entitled to the protections of American citizens, and they plainly are.
Nancy Gertner, I'm underqualified to read this opinion, but I liked pretty much everything about Judge Young's prose, starting with his impudence in rating Donald Trump himself as a person and a president, but also the range of people he quoted, from Shakespeare to Ronald Reagan to his own wife. And most particularly, I liked it because Judge Young threw his punchline question to all of us as citizens. He said that President Trump's calculation is that the American people are so divided that today they will not stand up. They will not fight for and defend our most precious constitutional values. And the last line in his opinion asks, very simply, is he right? I ask you, Nancy Gertner, how many federal judges think and write so powerfully as Judge Young?
There have been many, actually. There have been many who have described the violations of constitutional rights that they have found in very graphic terms. Let me focus for a moment on the District of Columbia.
Sure.
When the District of Columbia judges were asked to dismiss the defendants who had been convicted in the January 6 cases because the president had pardoned them, judge after judge, no matter who had appointed them, no matter where they came from, said, yes, I will dismiss because I have to. Presidential pardon, literally, it wipes out a criminal conviction. So I have to dismiss. But let me tell you what these people did. And there were pages and pages of findings about what they did to deserve being criminally prosecuted. That was extraordinary. There was a judge who, in the opening paragraph of his decision, said that what the Trump administration was doing in that case violated the statutes, the Constitution, and any law in the universe. So the language of judges have, in fact, been quite clear and quite striking. And I think it reflects the distance between what is lawful and what this administration is doing. People talk all the time about how is it that Trump seems to be losing in the lower courts, and the reason he's losing in the lower courts is because what he's doing is incontestably illegal, and that's reflected in the decision. Now, Judge Young certainly went further in his decision than other judges have gone to comment about public events and to comment about the Trump administration. And some might say that that's really not appropriate for a decision. But others have also commented very stridently. Let me say one other thing. When I was on the bench, I felt very strongly. I left the bench in 2011, pre-Trump. I felt very strongly that we no longer were in a universe in which judges could assume that people would find their opinions legitimate or find their actions legitimate. That in a world of social media, and that was beginning in 2011, the undermining of the courts was happening with every shock jock and every, meme. Not to this degree.
Influencer.
Right. And I spoke quite regularly about the importance of judges writing decisions in English, meaning in a way that human beings can understand, in a way that made clear what they were doing. In fact, I urge judges to write careful opinions that would speak to the public. In my case, the first 3 pages of almost every opinion I wrote, I regarded as a press release. Ladies and gentlemen of the public, here's what I'm trying to do. As I said, other judges have done that in the post-Trump era. Judge Young's decision certainly went further than anyone I've ever seen.
Yeah, you've got the opinion in hand there. I mean, read the exemplary passages, if you will, the ones that struck you as interesting.
First, he talks about the unitary presidency, and he talks about something he said in open court. He said, "We've never had a president like President Trump. He espouses, and he is the first president in our history to espouse a concept of the unified presidency. The idea is the president of the United States, and certainly he is duly elected after a full and fair election. The president of the United States is the single superior executive motive force for all federal employees under Article 2. And then he expresses his views through directives, through requirements. So the idea of a reasoned discourse in the sense of Lincoln's team of rivals, or FDR, combating the Depression or mobilizing for World War II and creating bureaucratic empires that sparred with one another until under his final decision, that's absence from our discourse, he says. This was something he's quoting himself speaking in court. He says, I ask you, we're not seeing the wonky white papers out of this administration. So he's describing a very different administration, one in which all power, according to Trump, is vested in the president. And therefore, you don't get contrary views within the executive. You don't get people saying, actually, President Trump, you should not bomb Venezuelan boats for suspected drug dealing. He's not getting that blowback. And then Judge Young goes directly at President Trump. And he quotes his wife, who says, quote, he seems to be winning, he ignores everything and keeps bullying ahead.
How often do spouses get quoted?
Never. And in part, Judge Young drops a footnote there and says, I don't discuss pending cases with anyone outside chambers. So he understands that it is vulnerable to be quoting one's spouse about anything because it implies that you talked about the case to her. And of course, that's not, he denies that what was going on.
The quoter he does, she said, he ignores everything and keeps bullying ahead.
Right. And then Judge Young characterizes that and says, quote, triumphalism is the very essence of the Trump brand. Often this is naught but hollow bragging. Quote, my perfect administration, end quote, wearing a baseball cap in the presidential Oval Office emblazoned, quote, Trump was right about everything, end quote, or most recently depicting himself as an officer in the 1st Cavalry Division, end quote. And then he goes on to say, this obscures the very real and sweeping changes President Trump has wrought in his first year in office. If change is the mark of success, President Trump is the most successful president in history. Now that he's our duly elected president after a full and fair election, he not only enjoys broad immunity from any personal liability, citing the Supreme Court's case, he's prepared to deploy all the resources of the nation against obstruction, period. And then Judge Young says, quote, daunting prospect, isn't it, end quote.
Now read this paragraph where he talks about the president bullying on. Whether it's social media, print, or television, President Trump is the master communicator of our time. His speech dominates today's American idiom. Indeed, it may be said to define it. It is triumphal, transactional, imperative, bellicose, and coarse. It seeks to persuade, not through marshaling data-driven evidence, science, or moral suasion, but through power.
Right. I mean, he basically characterizes, and dare I say it, attacks the president for the way in which he has been proceeding. Quote, while the president naturally seeks warm and cheering and gladsome welcoming acceptance of his views, in the real world, he'll settle for sullen silence and obedience. Then he goes on to talk about really a very chilling critique of the president, not particularly appropriate for an opinion. He says, quote, when he drifts off into calling people traitors and condemning them for treason, however, he reveals an ignorance of the crime and the special burden of proof it requires. Such speech is not protected by the First Amendment. It is defamatory. But in his official capacity as president, however, President Trump enjoys broad immunity from any civil liability. So he has characterized what the president is doing. He has challenged it. He has called it potentially defamatory. And let me say, because I have to say it, that while these may be important things to say in an opinion piece, there is considerable debate about whether it was legitimate in an opinion of a
Better
judge.
an op-ed.
Better an op-ed
But
than
I've
in
never
a...
read an op-ed as incisive, as powerful, as supported as this opinion.
Well, the parts of this opinion which are extraordinary, which speak to the violations of free speech, which speak to what Noam and Rubio have said about how broadly they have defined anti-Semitism, how broadly they have defined inappropriate speech that sort of transgresses every rule about what we know about the First Amendment. All of that is completely appropriate in an opinion and core to his findings. When he goes on to say that in other settings, with respect to other people in the rest of his presidency, he could well be defamatory, he could well be wrong, then he's dealing with the language of opinion pieces, that is to say, op-eds, and not the language of a decision.
I have a feeling that this will be read 100 years from now, if the world is still here, more respectfully than any op-ed out there at the moment. In other words, he's won the battle of how to define this presidency, and it chills me. Can I turn to a later page here where he surprised me by quoting Ronald Reagan at some length, the eloquent Ronald Reagan, who said, freedom is a fragile thing and it's never more than one generation away from extinction. It is not ours by way of inheritance. It must be fought for and defended constantly by each generation, for it comes only once to a people. I don't remember Ronald Reagan saying that, but it's important, getting our attention. But then I'd love to hear this in your voice, at the conclusion of his opinion, he imagines Donald Trump's reading of the Reagan warning.
Because he winds up saying freedom is fragile, and therefore it has to be fought for in each generation, which is what President Reagan was saying. What he believes Trump is taking from that comment is that freedom is fragile, and therefore I can tread on it.
Exactly. Read that last paragraph, if you would.
He said, I was deeply moved and hold these words before me as I discharged judicial duties. As I've read and reread the record in this case, listened widely and reflected extensively, I've come to believe President Trump truly understands and appreciates the full import of President Reagan's inspiring message. Yet I fear he has drawn from it a darker, more cynical message. I fear President Trump believes the American people are so divided today that they will not stand up, fight for, and defend our most precious constitutional values, so long as they are lulled into thinking their own personal interests are not affected. Is he correct?
He's asking us to judge whether we have the stomach for a fight over free speech.
Right. Free speech and everything else that the president is doing. And that actually conveys a very important message, it seems to me, which is, when will the American public move? When we're dealing with immigrants and people who are illegally in this country, when we are dealing with protesters in Portland, Chicago, and Los Angeles, when we are dealing with people that perhaps the general public can describe as them and not us, and therefore they don't regard these as real threats. And he offers a challenge and suggests that, in fact, people should understand that we're next.
Nancy Gertner, I mean, summing it up, for you, what is the gravest threat to the rule of law out there? And what are you counting on to save us from the danger, including the Supreme Court?
I can't identify what is the gravest threat, because to some degree, the gravest threat of all is the president's refusal to follow either the Constitution when he announces there's no such thing as birthright citizenship, when it's plainly in the Constitution, his unwillingness to follow statutes when he decides that he alone can impound funds that
Right.
Congress has passed for the use of the American people to basically fund programs, when he has attacked public figures who are comedians for criticizing him. In one sense, I have to abstract from all of this and say that the greatest threat is a president who is lawless. The president who is simply not respecting the Constitution, the laws, the statutes, or the norms of our country. It's at a level of abstraction, but that is the greatest threat as far as I'm concerned. The courts are standing up to him. The district courts are clearly standing up to him, and in these challenges across the country, the district courts are sort of meeting the moment, as people are saying. The courts of appeals, the courts above the district courts, are also meeting the moment. The Supreme Court is not. The Supreme Court not only has handed Trump victories in cases that the lower courts have found he has done wrong, but the Supreme Court has handed him victories in perfunctory, in my view, largely incoherent paragraphs without full opinions.
How do we explain the, shall we say, shyness or the passivity of the Roberts Court so far? 20 years now that the Chief Justice has been on that court. Why so quiet? Why so hesitant?
Oh, I don't think they've been quiet at all. They were thunderous in their decision on president's immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts. They were thunderous. That was a decision that went way, way beyond what they had to decide. The only question in that decision was whether Trump's actions in the various cases that were coming up before he was reelected, whether Trump's actions should be immune from criminal liability. That was the only question. Justice Gorsuch, in the middle of the oral argument, said, "We're writing a decision for the ages." They were not. They were deciding that case, saying those actions were immune. They were not defining presidential immunity in all situations, but they did. And the way in which they defined it really enabled what David Cole has written in the New York Review of Books this month, has enabled Trump to shoot someone in Times Square and escape liability, if that is his official act. It has enabled him to bomb Venezuelan boats on the suspicion that they are trafficking drugs, basically bypassing every norm, rule, international law, everything, and enabled essentially by this decision. So no, they have not been quiet. They have been very proactive. They've been very proactive in their endorsement of what is called the unitary presidency, which is the notion that the president, no matter how much power Congress has given agencies, the president can basically override that power and fire people who have been in long-term positions, like, the head of the Consumer Finance Bureau, and sort of aggregating all the power of the executive in him, no matter what the law says, no matter what the statutes say. They have not been quiet with respect to that. What has happened is between the end of the term in June and now, there have been numbers of emergency orders. And those emergency orders have essentially undone what district court judges have done.
You were quoted in the New York Times, Nancy Gertner, saying that the Supreme Court has shocked me the most in this big picture. You addressed the thought that's out there that the court is taking its time so as to amass credibility with Trump so that he will abide by their orders when they eventually rule against him. You said, "I am more and more skeptical of that notion. I believe that they are fully on board with enabling him."
At the beginning, I thought that the Supreme Court was, as they say, kicking the can down the road.
Yes.
Which is to say, approving what Trump was doing to avoid a constitutional crisis, and that they would save their fire for when it really mattered. But as time has gone on, and I have watched them affirm undo the rules regarding when you give emergency relief to one side. When I've seen them take positions which were frankly extraordinary to me, I now doubt whether or not they are kicking the can down the road to preserve their legitimacy for when they rule against him. I am now troubled that they will rule against him in any case that mattered. That was the gist of what I was saying.
Interesting.
The Supreme Court has acted in a way that we never expected a court to act. This court in general, any court in general, and this court in particular to act. Cases have gone up to the Supreme Court saying, I'm losing my job. He's now done a reduction in force that had absolutely no basis. He's cut out numbers and numbers of jobs. I am harmed. The government isn't harmed because they will then continue as they have been for 100 years, having these various agencies and these various jobs. The Supreme Court has said, no, we're going to find irreparable harm on the part of the government. The government, who's basically will simply continue as it always has, while the people who have been challenging the government are losing jobs, losing their positions, losing mortgages, etc. And there's no harm on their side. So the court has reconfigured the rules in the emergency cases up and down the line. And so I have lost confidence that they will not reconfigure the rules even when it matters. That was the gist of what I was saying to the New York Times.
I get it. What do they want to do in the end? How do they see it playing out?
The Supreme Court?
Yes.
I think that the conservative supermajority on the court includes people who believe that Trump should be able to do whatever he wants to do. That they believe that there should be very few limits on presidential power. So there are certainly those on the court who believe that, and I think that there are others in the conservative supermajority who don't have the power or the interest in countering that.
Are we talking theory of law or a presidential personality here?
I think there clearly is a very strong belief in what's called the unitary executive, which is all about the power of the president in the executive branch. And that is a theory that has been circulating on the right for a long period of time. So I think there clearly are justices on the Supreme Court who believe in that. One can believe in that and still believe there are limits, but what those limits are is unclear. Two things. One is that elections have consequences and that this president has a right to reflect the consequences of the election in numbers of ways. How far that goes is an open question. I, like many others, believe that the court will not eliminate birthright citizenship. In other words, the concept that if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen of the United States.
Right.
That would be a decision that would upend the language of the Constitution, upend the teachings of the Civil War, for which there is absolutely no justification. If that decision goes the other way, then we are truly in trouble. This would be a decision that offends every rational interpretation of the Constitution. So there may be limits with this court, but so far we haven't seen them.
Under the general heading of rule of law, there's another very different point we haven't mentioned. It troubles people that Donald Trump seems to persecute, almost to stalk certain personal enemies and bring the full weight of the Justice Department down on them. James Comey is the most famous example. Does that trouble you, that he's bringing a whole history of litigation and his business and political struggles to punish the people who are on the other side?
Right. We've never seen that. Because even if a president wanted to punish a political enemy, there are layers and layers of review and analysis before he could be able to do that. So presidents are not allowed to do that. In other words, there are people who will say to him, you can't do that as a matter of law, or, you shouldn't do that because...
Or tradition.
That's right. There's no one in his administration who's doing that. And the Comey case is a classic example. Trump appointed prosecutors, looked at the Comey case and said there was not enough evidence to indict. Your audience should understand not having enough evidence to indict means something very substantial. It means there's not even probable cause, which is a very low standard to indict. So in the Comey case, 2 long-serviced prosecutors had to resign because they believed that there was not enough to indict Comey, and yet Trump found someone to indict Comey. That's what happens in Russia. That's what happens in an authoritarian state. The power of the state is essentially mobilized against an individual. That is not what has ever happened in the United States, and it is absolutely not what happened to Trump. He finds equivalent what happened to him with the various indictments and what he's doing with respect to Comey, and it is not equivalent. With respect to Trump, there was a lengthy investigation of his responsibility for the January 6th insurrection. The January 6th insurrection was a crime. We all saw it. We watched it on television.
People died.
Right. People died in it. Attorney General Garland spent a long time deciding whether or not to implicate Trump in that activity. And pages and pages of investigative materials were generated. In the case of the criminal case against him in Florida, the classified documents were in his bathroom. There was not a question that a crime had been committed. There was not an issue. Comey, there's no question that he wanted to go after Comey and they were going to contrive to find a crime. That's not the way we do things in a democracy. That's not the way we do things in a country that's bounded by the rule of law. So no, that is totally different. And to him, apparently to this president, there is no difference.
Nancy Gertner, in sum, we're talking about the trouble we're in or the trouble we're heading into. How bad does it look to you? And what's to be done about it?
Well, this is a moment when people have to resist. There are demonstrations scheduled around the country in which ordinary people will stand.
A lot of towns do it every Saturday or...
Right. People have to sort of show their resistance. The reason why that's important is that the Republican Party has essentially been quiescent in the face of these violations, and essentially they have to understand that there will be electoral consequences if they continue to back this president. So the people have to resist in every way that they can. Lawfully resist. There's no question we're talking about lawful resistance, but that has to be done. And maybe, apropos of your comments about Judge Young, judges who are finding against this administration, who believe that they are rightfully finding against this administration, have to make what they're doing clear in the most transparent language possible so that the public understands that these are not technical issues. We're not talking about, minor things. We're talking about fundamental cleavages in our rule of law, which this president is exploiting.
Do you think people understand it yet?
I'm not sure that everyone understands it. The person who's watching people being dragged off the street to be deported, or worse yet, what we're seeing now is people being dragged off the street who are American citizens.
Yes.
People dragged off the street who are possibly illegally in this country, but we don't know, and therefore we have no probable cause to arrest, and yet we are basically detaining them. People who see that certainly understand that that's not the way we've ever operated in this country.
What about those of us who haven't seen?
Right. Whether the guy on the corner understands that this will affect him too and his children. That the question is who is next, and an unfettered government, a government that is lawless, will affect him soon. And the question is, what should he do now to stop that?
You're saying study up, but protest. Be ready to take action.
I think it's a question of what are the ways in which a citizen can take action. One is obviously resisting, protesting, writing to your senators, writing to your congressmen, voting, all of the lawful ways in which you can protest. Americans should protest. In other countries, people have written about what has worked to stop the slide to authoritarianism. Poland is a classic example, which is people took to the streets in overwhelming numbers, in numbers that were incontestable. And I think that that's what we have to do here as well. To be sure, it has to be lawful. And the reason it has to be lawful is that President Trump is waiting for an excuse to declare an insurrection based on any kind of lawless protests. And then we will really have the troops at our doorstep. So people have to certainly be cautious about how they protest, but they need to protest. And they need to vote, and they need to write to everyone whom they know in the government. It has to be clear, at least to the Republican Party, that there will be consequences to their rolling over and playing dead in front of Donald Trump.
What's the line defining insurrection? the line to be watched very carefully.
The line defining insurrection is actually a legal and technical line.
Exactly.
But we have already seen with this president that he was declaring an emergency requiring federal troops in various parts of the country in which there was not the remotest emergency at all. So I think we're talking about nonviolent protest. I think we're talking about not crossing the line into violent protest in any way, shape, or form. Not because of violence, isolated violence in a protest, in fact, is an insurrection, but because he will call it such. And so people need to be cautious about how they protest, but people have to understand that this will affect all of us. If not today, then tomorrow or the next day. And this does affect all of us. It affects America's standing in the world. It will shortly affect the economy. It will affect universities and places where our kids are being educated. It will affect all of us. And we have to show up.
Nancy Gertner, thank you. You bring a lot of experience and wisdom to the question. I love hearing you read that opinion and your own warning, too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nancy Gertner retired as a federal court judge 4 years ago to teach at the Harvard Law School and to write a very public blog on her lifelong interests: women's rights, civil liberties, and justice for all. Our conversation here at Open Source relies on listener support. If you haven't done your part yet, now's the time to go to radioopensource.org/donate and pitch in to keep the world's first and longest-running podcast going strong. Leave a comment while you're at it. We're proud to be a founding member of Hub and Spoke, a Boston-based collective of independent, creator-owned podcasts. Our shows range from history to technology to politics to art. We come together around the principle that independent voices and independently funded media are more important now than ever. You can learn more at hubspokeaudio.org. And thank you